I didn't grow up thinking a ranch like this would ever belong to me. 3,200 acres. A private lake. Fences that ran so far you forgot where they started. When the letter arrived from the state attorney, I assumed it was a mistake. My uncle had always been private, quiet in the way people get when they've spent a lifetime earning distance. We weren't estranged, but we weren't close either. Occasional calls. Holiday messages. Nothing that hinted I'd inherit the largest single property in the county. But the paperwork was real. The ranch had been in his name for decades. No HOA membership. No shared agreements. No easements tied to community access. Just land, water, and recorded boundaries stretching back farther than most of the houses nearby. I visited a week later. The lake was the first thing I noticed, not because it was flashy but because it was still. No docks packed with people. No signs. Just water reflecting the sky like it had nothing to prove. I walked the shoreline for nearly an hour, reading survey markers, matching them to the maps I'd brought. Everything lined up exactly as the county records said it would. That's when I noticed the houses. Dozens of them. Built right up to the edge of the property line, like someone had assumed the ranch would never push back. They were newer than the land, newer than the fences, newer than the lake's quiet authority. That assumption would become important later. The HOA introduced itself within days. A formal letter. Friendly tone. Congratulations on the inheritance. They welcomed me to the community and mentioned how excited everyone was about continuing shared access to the lake. That phrase, shared access, stood out. I read the letter twice. Then I checked the attachments. There were none. No agreement. No deed reference. No recorded easement. Just expectation. I replied politely. Thanked them. Asked for documentation supporting any shared access rights. The response came quickly. They explained that the lake had always been treated as communal. That previous boards had operated under an understanding. That neighbors had used it for years without issue. What they didn't say was more important. They didn't say owned. They didn't say recorded. They didn't say legal. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I simply repeated the request. Documentation. That's when the tone shifted. The next email came from the HOA president directly. Confident. Firm. She explained that restricting access would create conflict and that cooperation would be in everyone's best interest. I asked again for documents. She said they would circle back. They didn't. Instead, I started noticing activity. Cars parked near the lake. People walking paths that crossed my land. Kayaks on water that didn't belong to them. Not aggressively. Not maliciously. Casually. As if the line between private and communal had simply been blurred long enough to disappear. I understood how it happened. When land sits quietly, people fill the silence with assumptions. The HOA sent another message, this one outlining maintenance contributions for lake upkeep. Dues. Fees. A suggested amount based on historical usage. I didn't pay. I responded with a single sentence. Please provide the recorded basis for these charges. That was when the calls started. Friendly at first. Then frustrated. Then insistent. They weren't used to being questioned. What I didn't know yet was how far they decided to take it, or how much they'd already convinced themselves that the lake wasn't really mine. Because once someone believes something strongly enough, paperwork starts to feel like an inconvenience. And inconvenience to the wrong people feels like an obstacle that needs to be removed. Quietly. Confidently. At any cost. The HOA didn't wait for my answer. They acted like they'd already received it. Within a week, a printed notice appeared at the edge of the lake, laminated, neatly stapled to a post. It announced community lake hours and listed a set of rules I'd never agreed to. No fires. No loud music. Respect shared access. Shared. I took it down the same day. The next morning it was back. That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a test. I called the county to confirm what I already knew. The clerk pulled the file, reviewed the survey, and said something that stuck with me. There's no public or private easement on that lake, she said. Not now. Not ever. I thanked her, and asked for certified copies. The HOA sent another email, longer this time. It referenced long-standing use, verbal permissions, and community reliance. It cited nothing official, but it used a lot of confident language, as if repetition alone could turn memory into law. I replied once. Please provide the recorded easement or deed language supporting lake access. Silence. Then the pressure shifted. Neighbors I'd never met before stopped me on the road. Some were polite, asking if access would continue. Others weren't. One man told me flatly that you can't just take something away that people are used to. I told him I wasn't taking anything. I was keeping what was mine. The HOA president, Karen, requested a meeting. She arrived with 2 board members and a folder thick with paper. We sat at a picnic table overlooking the lake. She spoke first, confidently, explaining how the HOA managed the lake, how dues had historically gone toward maintenance, and how access was baked into the community. When she finished, I asked one question. Which document gives you that authority? She flipped through the folder. What she showed me were meeting minutes, newsletters, and photos of past events. Barbecues, fishing tournaments, canoes lined up on the shore. Not a single legal record. She closed the folder and said, "This has never been an issue before." I nodded. That doesn't make it mine less now. Her smile tightened. You're being difficult. I didn't respond. She leaned forward. We can make this easy, or we can make it complicated. That was the moment the conversation changed. Because when someone frames cooperation as a threat, they've already decided you're the problem. I stood up. If you find a deed or easement, send it. Until then, the lake is private. They left without shaking my hand. 2 days later, I received a notice of violation. It claimed I was interfering with community assets and warned of fines if access wasn't restored. The amount was listed per day. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. Authority, when questioned, often reaches for punishment. I responded with a copy of the deed and survey, highlighted. No commentary, no emotion, just facts. That's when the HOA stopped pretending. The next move wouldn't be polite. It wouldn't be quiet. And it wouldn't be legal. The fine started before I had time to finish my coffee. $100 a day for denial of community access. Then $200. Then $5. The amounts escalated quickly, as if speed could compensate for legitimacy. Each notice arrived by email and certified mail, stamped with urgency and authority. Each one referenced HOA bylaws I wasn't subject to and obligations I'd never agreed to. I ignored them, not out of defiance, but because responding would have implied consent. Instead, I documented everything. Photos of posted notices, screenshots of emails, dates, times, names. Then the truck showed up, unmarked at first. Contractors, according to the HOA, sent to maintain the lake. They parked near the access road and started unloading equipment like they'd done it 100 times before. I stopped them before they reached the water. When I asked who hired them, they gave Karen's name. When I asked for work order, they didn't have one that referenced my permission. I told them to leave. They hesitated, confused, stuck between a job and a boundary they hadn't known existed. I showed them the deed. They packed up and drove off. That evening, the HOA sent a message accusing me of interfering with contracted services. They added another fine. I responded with one sentence. Unauthorized entry is trespassing. The reply came fast. They claimed the road was effectively communal and that restricting it violated neighborhood norms. They warned of legal action. They suggested mediation. They implied consequences. I didn't argue. I called a lawyer. She listened carefully, reviewed the documents, and said something I hadn't expected. They're counting on you folding, she said. This only works if you're intimidated. She advised me to install cameras, mark boundaries clearly, and stop communicating directly. So I did. Signs went up along the road. Fences were reinforced where they needed to be. Cameras covered every approach. The HOA noticed immediately. Karen showed up in person the next morning, standing at the gate with a clipboard and a phone. "You're escalating this," she said. "No," I replied. "You are." She told me the board had voted to assume temporary control of the lake pending resolution. She said they'd authorized contractors to proceed regardless of my objections. I asked her if she was aware that doing so could expose the HOA to liability. She smiled. "We'll see." That afternoon, I received an email from a real estate platform. Someone had listed the lake property. Not the ranch, not the land, the lake itself. The description claimed exclusive development potential and community-managed transfer. My name wasn't on it. Karen's was. That's when I understood. This wasn't about access anymore. It was about control. And once control becomes the goal, rules become optional. I printed the listing, saved every version of it, and forwarded everything to my lawyer. She called me back 10 minutes later. "This just crossed a line," she said. I looked out at the lake, calm and unchanged, while people miles away convinced themselves it was theirs to sell. And I realized something important. The HOA hadn't misread the law. They decided it didn't apply to them. That decision was about to cost them far more than access to a lake. It was about to cost them everything. The buyer showed up on a Tuesday. Mid-morning. Clean truck. Polite knock. He stood at the edge of the access road holding a brochure that looked painfully official, drone photos, acreage numbers, promises of exclusive lake rights. He introduced himself and said he was early for a scheduled walkthrough. I asked who scheduled it. He gave Karen's name. I told him the lake wasn't for sale. He frowned. "That's not what the listing says." I invited him to look at the deed. 5 minutes later, he was apologizing and backing away, embarrassed by a situation he'd unknowingly stepped into. I didn't blame him. I thanked him for coming and suggested he speak with his agent. As his truck disappeared down the road, I closed the gate. For the first time since the inheritance, I locked it. The timing couldn't have been better. Karen arrived less than 10 minutes later, visibly agitated, phone already in her hand. She demanded to know why the buyer had left and why the gate was locked. I told her the listing was fraudulent and the property was private. She laughed. "You don't get to decide that." I told her the county already had. She said she was calling the police. I told her that was a good idea. The officers arrived with the usual neutrality. 2 cars, calm approach, no assumptions. Karen rushed to them, explaining how I was blocking a lawful sale and interfering with community assets. When they asked for proof, she gave them the listing. When they asked for ownership, she gave them minutes from HOA meetings. When they asked for a deed, she had nothing. I showed them mine. The mood changed instantly. One officer stepped aside to confirm the records. The other asked Karen directly whether she had authority to sell property she didn't own. She tried to redirect. Then she tried to argue. Then she tried to minimize. None of it worked. They asked her to step away from the gate. They asked more questions. Then they asked her to turn around. The sound of the cuffs was quiet, but unmistakable. As they escorted her toward the patrol car, she looked back at the lake like it had betrayed her. The officers explained she was being detained for questioning related to fraud and misrepresentation. The listing was taken down before the car left the road. The HOA didn't call again that day, or the next, or the one after that. The gate stayed locked, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of Overreach finally meeting reality. The HOA didn't collapse overnight. It unraveled. Slowly. Quietly. The way systems do when the thing holding them together turns out to be a lie everyone was pretending not to see. Karen resigned within the week. The announcement email framed it as a personal decision, but no one asked follow-up questions. The real story had already traveled faster than any official statement could. Then came the letters. From lawyers this time, measured, careful, stripped of all the confidence the HOA's earlier messages had carried. They asked about amicable resolutions, about historic access considerations, about whether I might entertain a limited use agreement. I declined every one, not out of spite, out of clarity. The fines disappeared from my account. The violation notices were quietly retracted. The HOA amended its bylaws to clarify that the lake was not, and never had been, a community asset. That amendment mattered more than any apology, because it was permanent. Neighbors stopped coming down the road. The signs stayed up. The cameras stayed on. And life settled into something simpler than it had been before. Peace without negotiation. A few months later, the county sent confirmation that the fraudulent listing had been formally closed and that the HOA had been warned against any future misrepresentation. The letter didn't mention names. It didn't need to. The HOA lost more than access to a lake. They lost credibility, authority, the unspoken assumption that they could act first and justify later. They lost the illusion that proximity equals ownership. As for me, I inherited exactly what my uncle intended. Land that stood on its own. Water that reflected truth without distortion. Boundaries that didn't move just because someone pushed on them. The ranch didn't change. People did. And that, more than any arrest or letter or fine reversal, was the real outcome. Because when overreach fails publicly, it doesn't just stop, it warns. The lake stayed still. The gate stayed closed. And the lesson stayed clear. Quiet justice doesn't announce itself. It simply holds its ground.